a deeper, more problematic reflection on our theme of question is, has liberal Asian studies failed politically? Now, our particular theme has been thus far, over 2 volumes, looking at the liberal response, the woke response, if you will, to the Japanese miracle. And having made what I thought was a responsible, pluralistic, in other words, I wasn't asking to eliminate other people's points of view, I was just saying allowing mine to be part of the picture. This was rejected. My liberal colleagues were not going to have a positive portrait of Japan, especially one with pre-war roots. And so much of the Japanese miracle was pre-war, so this wasn't going to happen. So the litmus test here of attitudes was the war itself. When you talked about pre-war and wartime and post-war, and you talked about any kind of continuity of institutions, for example, let alone people, democratic politicians, civil servants, what have you, then the left and its Japanese allies, pacifist allies, would raise up their hands in complete revolt about this. These people are contaminated, they're pernicious, they're evil, you cannot celebrate, even examine them, except through a critical lens. Now, to summarize again, to return to my metaphor of the Titanic, my liberal colleagues, to my mind, appear to have the view that when the iceberg appears over the bow, and that the iceberg is my metaphor for reality, their assumption, their instinctive reaction is to consciously or unconsciously pick up a volume of Immanuel Kant on ethics, walk to the edge of the ship, raise the volume toward the iceberg, and in that magical moment of ethical judgment, the iceberg will disappear. Now, I don't believe this is true, but they did. They do. So I thought, okay, if this was going to be the line of argument, maybe we need to go and look at the war itself, which was the turning point in all of this. The before and after, the good after and the bad before. So I proceeded down the most dangerous path of all by looking at, for example, in my case, the Kyoto school of philosophy, wartime right-wing thinkers, nationalists, but critics of Tojo. So first of all, you arrived at this implication that the Japanese right-wing people in charge, Tojo's cabinet, was a culmination of a right-wing, using French revolutionary vocabulary language, to establish a regime, the first authentic regime capable of action, uninhibited action between the death of the Emperor Meiji in 1912 and the decision taken for the Tojo government to form in, I think, October 1941, in the context of making a decision about war with the United States and Britain, for that matter, the Pearl Harbor decision. So, between those two events, we have what we call interwar Japan. Now, my belief was that interwar Japan was governed by Confucian logic, the search for an effective resolution of the divided nature of the Japanese political system. With the end of Meiji rule, Taisho was not a solution. It was not a permanent solution. It was not what I call a Confucian revolution. The mandate of heaven had not settled firmly on anyone's shoulders. And the struggle of the interwar period was to find a regime that was obviously legitimate because successful. And whatever doubts one may have had about it, whatever the doubts even the Kyoto school had it, Tojo came the closest to achieving that, not by him personally, because he was an army general. This was a junta. And the Navy was a supporting role, but the Army was the lead actor. And that was a military government, in effect, but working through the civilian forms of the pre-war period, the constitutional forms. Tojo was not a demagogue when Tojo was prime minister. So this is the thing. So, if the right wing was divided, we need to look at this. So I proceeded down, just to, to draw a line in the sand, so to speak, I called the book, the next book, Defending Japan's Pacific War. Now, of course, my colleagues were completely ballistic over this, but I needed to get their attention, and I wanted to focus on something that the Kyoto school made a defense of the Pacific War, but didn't approve of Tojo's tactics. They were not supportive of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They proposed a different way, but they thought the United States' imperial reach across the Pacific had to be resisted. And the reason it had to be resisted, because the fundamental problem Japan had, and has now, and is China. The Pacific War, we think, was a war with the United States, but the real war of consequence was not the Pacific War. The real war of consequence in Japanese minds was the East Asian War, East Asian Prosperity War, the struggle to create a pro-Japanese regime on the continent. That was what it was about. The United States, in that sense, was a sideshow. You see how much pressure this would put on orthodox Allied interpretation of the Second World War. It's one thing saying you didn't know why you won, it's quite another to say you were a sideshow in winning, but that's what I was proposing. So, Kyoto School. This required some careful textual work. My colleagues were still holding their noses every time they heard it. I heard colleagues, English colleagues who had good Japanese saying, oh, Tanabe Hajime, the Japanese Kyoto school philosopher, far too difficult to read. Well, it is difficult to read, but that's what I call heavy lifting. You get in there and you sit with the text long enough to make sense of it. And that's what I endeavor to do, because Tanabe is my favorite, and he is despised by my left-wing colleagues, Japanese and European and Western and American and Australian, the whole gang despise him, but I think he's fascinating. He has a lot to say, and he does not deserve to be cancelled any more than I do. Just for saying, I'm looking at these texts responsibly. No one said I didn't look at them properly. They said I shouldn't look at them at all. And that's not where I was proposing to go. So very briefly, what did I intend to do? Well, from my colleague's point of view, it was cause endless amounts of trouble. But I was, in one sense, a prophet without honor in my own country. And that was in the subtitle. The subtitle of the book was The Kyoto School Philosophers and Post-White Power. Now, here all these years before, we arrive at the world of Nick Fuentes, of English nationalism, of the call for the expulsion of non-whites from England and the United States. The race issue. And this is another, even mentioning the word drove my colleagues to anger, irritation, and incomprehension. But it was in the cards. This Welsh Gifforialism. I'm thinking, I do see the iceberg, and it isn't what you think it is. So, having done that, rise and fall was one theme. Revisionism in Japanese studies included the theme of the end of white America in Asian studies and what that meant. I lectured at it in important places in Britain, and again met with incomprehension. But I thought, this racial issue, the declining demographic, the altering demographic, the de-whitening of America and the browning of America with the Latino arrivals, this was serious. This was going to have consequence on how Japanese studies looked at everything. One. Okay, then we got into the thing, the decay of Pacific War orthodoxy. My colleagues, by and large, were Pacific Orthodox proponents, and I didn't think this dance could go on. So I said so, and I thought it was declining for evident reasons, the iceberg. Then we looked at in the defense of the Kyoto school, to actually go through them and see what they were arguing and why this was worth looking at, why there was a power position, and simply saying, this is verboten, we will not think about this, we cannot deal with these people, to study them seriously is to endorse them. I just rejected that entirely, and I think my colleagues on this were wrong. Now, relatedly, that plunges in yet another difficulty, thicket, and that was Nazism and the crisis of the Kyoto school, where the label of fascism was applied to the Nazi thinkers, Heidegger, for example, and then turned around and applied to the Kyoto school as well. So you had to deal with both. And it was interesting because there's a dialogue between the both. Tanabe wrote one of the first reviews in a Japanese newspaper of Heidegger's rectoral address on assuming leadership of Freiburg University very shortly after Hitler came to power. I mean, there's this thing, and you go back and we'll see what did Tanabe say about Heidegger, for example. Then having done that, we've got a momentous theme of after America philosophy. The understanding of truth, the disciplined, scientific, methodical, rational understanding of the truth, and the fate of the United States as it demographically changed to become something else. Now, I concluded with two texts, translation of two texts by Tanabe Hajime, but mainly I gave a very careful reading of his work, in which I think I proved, to my mind, chapter and verse, that the left wing, the neo-Marxist, for example, interpretation of Tanabe could not fly. It just did not make sense. It wasn't faithful to the meaning and the plausible interpretation of the text. Now, at this point, my academic reputation, such as it was, I was verboten, my God, that David Williams, he's a fascist. Now, wasn't a fascist, but I took my colleagues seriously, and my next book was an endeavor to mend fences by doing a Festschrift for Professor Stockwin, the Nissen Professor of Japanese Studies at Oxford. And that will be the next topic of my fence-mending enterprise.